welcome back for another CJP safety podcast. We're going to talk today about, again, putting together some of the material we've talked about so far with landing performance. And in particular, one of the dangers and hazards of using a common source of performance that I imagine most pilots frequently or occasionally do, which is the quick reference handbook that we all likely have in a pocket of the airplane, accessible to the pilot. And that information can certainly be useful for quick, simple performance problems. But as we're about to see, there are some inherent issues with it that we have to be mindful of. So when we use tabulated performance data, and by that we mean data from either the abbreviated checklist we were just looking at or from the AFM itself, we have to be mindful of an important fact, and that is that the landing data is based on a zero slope situation. And landing on a downslope will significantly increase our landing distance, and we have to apply a correction factor to get the correct landing distance. So let's look at a specific example. In Arizona, 18 Alpha Zulu, Sky Ranch at Carefree. At first blush, this runway would not appear to present a challenge for particularly the lighter citation. So we're going to use the example of a Mustang, the lightest and smallest with very low approach speeds, VREF in the 80 knots range, high 80s typically. So a little over 4,000 feet. We're going to talk about landing on runway 24, which has a 500-foot displaced threshold. With that, we get a landing distance available of 35-37. Again, a little bit short, but certainly something that many Mustang pilots would, at first blush, feel comfortable with. There's one problem, though, we haven't talked about yet, and that is the runway has a significant slope downhill when landing on runway 24. So given the displaced threshold and given the downslope, clearly landing on 6 would be our first choice. But that's not always going to be possible. Our jets all have a 10-knot tailwind component limit for landing. That is a limitation. So certainly on a day when the winds were out of the southwest and were very gusty, landing on runway 6 would not be either legal or advisable. So on a day when the winds are strong out of the southwest, we would expect that runway 24 would be the option. So let's take a look at that. If, again, we just pulled out our quick reference handbook, we're actually going to use the AFM data, but it would be similar just without the wind corrections. So we're looking at a pressure altitude of 2,000 feet for a weight of 7,000 pounds for a Citation Mustang again. And what we see here is at 10 degrees Celsius and 20 knots of headwind. So again, we're assuming a real strong wind down the runway, which of course in itself would probably present problems, but we're going to ignore those other issues. But we have a benefit of a really strong headwind down the runway, 10 degrees, and we see that we have a unfactored landing distance of 1950. So again, on first blush, even a somewhat conservative pilot might look at that and say, wow, well, I have a huge safety factor. I have 3,500 feet to land on. I have about 2,000 feet I'm going to need. That seems great. I'm going to go ahead. But we'd be neglecting the note at the bottom of each page of the AFM and in the quick reference book as well, which says with downhill runway gradient, we have to refer to landing procedures to get the final answer. And that's in the AFM a few pages back from the landing tables. And what this tells us is if we are going to land on a 2% downhill runway gradient, in a Mustang with stall warning normal, not at an elevated setting for icing conditions, then we have a 2x multiple from whatever we derive from that table. So we have to take that 1950, we have to multiply it by 2, and our final answer is 3,900 feet required. Again, this is an unfactored distance. This is not taking into account our SOPs yet. This is simply what our legal minimum is using our AFM data. So even at a very lightweight, even with 20 knots of wind right down the runway, a Citation Mustang using AFM data is not legal to land on runway 24. But that's only one consideration. We have a couple more considerations to get at, but first I want to take a quick peek Other AFMs show similar correction tables for the M2, the CJ2 plus, CJ3. I just pulled a few common citations at random, and they're all generally 1.75 to 2% on a multiple on a 2% downhill slope, again, using AFM data. Okay, but I said we had a couple other considerations to talk about, which was, is our effective LDA really 35, 37? And you may recall we have talked before about the concept of runway safety areas. And the idea is after an aborted takeoff or after a landing, we're going to do our performance planning. We're going to hopefully factor our landing distance. And that factor distance is going to represent the amount of runway we think in a worst case scenario we might use. So we are a little fast, we float for a little bit, we're not aggressive on the brakes, right? That's what the factored landing distance is doing. It's giving us a safety factor so that we stay on the runway. What the runway safety area is designed to do is to say, hey, even if you're using a safety factor, there's going to be times when it's not going to be enough, particularly if you're using the less conservative 80% safety factor. So we don't want to have anything within 1,000 feet of the end of our runway that would present a real hazard to the airplane should we go off the end of the runway. Well, sure enough, on landing 2-4, only about 350 feet, 366 to be exact, past the end of the runway is a road. And certainly while we're landing 2-4 on this downhill slope, even if we're applying our safety factor, it's not unrealistic to consider that at some point there could be a runway overrun and that it could go more than 350 feet past the end of the runway on fairly level dirt and scrub. So if we take that 1,000-foot runway safety area that we want to have, now this is a private airport, so there are no declared distances published, but if it was a public airport, the FAA would actually require the airport management to measure back 1,000 feet from that hazard, that road in this case. And any runway that sits in that 1,000-foot safety area cannot be used for accelerate stop computations, or more relevant to us right now, for landing distance available computations. So if we take the roughly 650 feet of pavement that we lose and we look at just the portion between the displaced threshold and the start of the runway safety area, again, if this was a public use runway, we would see an LDA of about 2,900 feet. Now, we're not legally required to do this, but certainly this is an SOP that we encourage, because even using safety factoring, we always have to be aware that runway overruns continue to be the largest type of accidents that jets experience, and we would like to protect ourselves from making a poor landing. We would like the consequence to be humiliation, maybe some light damage, but not severe damage, and certainly not injury or death to the occupants of the airplane or to people on the ground. Bruised ego is all we're ever would hope for if we are going to see these overruns. So in that case, we have a 2903 LDA, even less than the 3,500 feet we started with. But one more step we have to think about using our SOPs. We want our landing to be calculated at best to require no more than 80% of the LDA, and you may recall that 80% comes into play if we meet some other factors in terms of pilot experience, recency of experience, in some sort of visual slope guidance, either a VASI, a PAPI, electronic guidance. Synthetic vision can be used for this. Creating a visual approach can be used for this. So when we do the safety factoring, what we see is that we would like to calculate landing performance that shows we stop in 2,322 feet. That would mean that we are allowing for deviation from optimal technique, because that 2322, let's say, if we look that up in the AFM, is going to represent the absolute best day that a test pilot ever had. So we don't expect to do that. So our 2,900 represents a little bit of padding for speed, height, flare, braking. And then that also is protecting us with the runway safety area. So clearly, using the AFM before we even take into account best practices of protecting ourselves with a runway safety area and protecting ourselves by using a factored landing distance, even before that, we were not legal using the AFM. There are some advantages to using runway analysis, both in terms of convenience and in terms of potentially access to airports. So all of the calculations we just went through can be automated easily using runway analysis programs. The slope correction safety factor, and then shortening of the runway for RSA purposes. I will mention this can also be done using CessNav, and this can also be done using the avionics decks of some of our airplanes that have the very newest loads. But with that said, we're going to look at the example of runway analysis, and there's another big example of using runway analysis or CessNav, which is that the correction factors for slope are significantly lower using runway analysis, because that 2% we saw in the AFM, it has to represent the worst case correction factor for landing on a 2% downhill slope across every combination of weight, altitude, temperature, and wind. So think about how big our AFM is. All those landing tables. What Cessna is going to do is look at the worst case scenario of how much landing on a 2% downhill goes up. And then that is the correction factor that they have to put in there. So that 2x multiplier is not necessarily indicative of how much more runway would be required at this airport at carefree, landing with a 20 knot headwind, 7,000 pounds. Okay, so what we're going to see is that, in fact, when we do the calculations using runway analysis, the slope correction factor is 1.43x, significantly less than the 2x. And there are some situations where you see that allows for some more latitude. So here's how this would happen. We would enter in on the arrival tab of our, this is the APG Genesis app we're looking at right here. It's a slightly newer version of the iPreflight app. Works similarly though. So we're looking at arrival, and we've put in, you can see wind conditions of 20 knots right down the runway, 10 degrees. The 3049 is just a nice high pressure that brings the exact pressure altitude down to 2,000 feet so that we can compare apples to apples when we were just looking at our tabulated data from the AFM. Our landing weight is 7,000 pounds again. Okay, and then what we see here is with an unfactored landing distance, we now would actually be legal to land here. So landing on runway 24, because we're only applying a roughly 40% safety multiplier for the, a slope multiplier. So this is our bare minimum unfactored landing distance, the best a test pilot could achieve. So we actually start out in a position where we are legal to land on runway 24. Okay. Now, our SOPs are going to drive, again, some further considerations, but as I said, this is done fairly easily using a runway analysis program. So the first thing we want to do is we don't want to look at our unfactored landing distance. So by tapping on the miscellaneous, that will pop up a correction factor menu, and 60 and 80% are default options built into the program. So we're going to tap on the 80% option. And when we do that and go back, we're going to now see that the 80% factor is applied, and our landing distance again still falls within that LDA of 35-37. So if we are comfortable with a encroachment into our 1,000-foot RSA, we still could land on this runway with a 20 knot headwind. Again, very advantageous winds, but recognize that what we're saying is a pretty good pilot flying pretty close to the numbers with normal expected deviation is still going to expect to use a good amount of this runway. Okay, a test pilot is going to be a little bit better off, but using an 80% safety factor, we don't have a lot of fudge factor. To really be properly conservative, though, we want to apply that runway safety area consideration. And the way we do that is we can tap right on the LDA, and we can shorten the LDA ourselves. So when we do that, we get this pop-up menu, and we're going to say we want to shorten the runway at the liftoff end where our RSA would be, and the exact amount it needs to be shortened to give us 1,000 feet clearance from that road is 634 feet. So when we do that, we see the new LDA is 2903, as we previously manually calculated, but of course going a lot quicker this way. And when we go back to our page we were just looking at, we will now see an option to select for the shortened runway at the threshold with a new LDA of 2903. And the landing distance, of course, is unchanged, but what we see is that our max landing weight is not shown because there is no weight at which we are capable of stopping in 2,900 feet with our 80% safety factoring. So Ultimately, we do get the same result if we want to apply all of our SOPs, but it is interesting to see how much more precise the data is and how much more easily it can be calculated by using runway analysis. So thanks for following along. I do appreciate that this is a complex topic, so I certainly would expect you might want to review the video a few times, and we look forward to the next time we discuss this, and we hope to have a live podcast soon with some call-in questions and to work some problems together.
The CJP Safety and Education Foundation is committed to providing all pilots with the best tools to safely operate their airplane. Our content is always free of charge, and you can access it by clicking on the Safety tab on our website. Until next time, fly safe.